Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Um, as those of you who've come to others of these events know, the thing I dislike most is breaking up conversation between colleagues. It is sort of the most musical sound at this law school. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but we should definitely get underway because we have a great event ahead of us. So good afternoon and welcome to the 2023 Addison C. Harris Lecture. I am Christiana Ochoa, and I am the Dean of the Indiana University Maurer School of Law. And for those of you who are here, we're incredibly grateful for your intrepidness in sliding and climbing and dusting off and breaking ice in order to get here. And for those of you who are not, we know that we've got a much larger at-home audience comfortable in your sweatpants and slippers. And so we are delighted that you are able to join us as well. So the Harris Lecture is one of our most important endowed lecture events. And this year we are honored to welcome Georgetown Law's Anupam Chander, an expert in the global regulation of new technologies. While I'll leave the formal introduction of Professor Chander to our own Professor Jay Krishnan, I would like to tell you just a little bit about the importance of this event to our law school. The Harris Lecture Series was established in 1946, and it is the law school's oldest endowed lecture series. The series is named after Addison C. Harris, who was born in 1840 and lived until 1916. He was a distinguished Indiana lawyer, a statesman, a member of the state Senate, and ambassador to Austria-Hungary. Harris grew up in Wayne County, Indiana, about halfway between Indianapolis and Dayton, Ohio, and became one of the state's most well-known lawyers during his lifetime. After his diplomatic posts, he returned to Indiana, helping to found the Indiana Law School, the predecessor to what would eventually become the McKinney School of Law at IUPUI. He was the founder and president of the Indiana Bar Association. He was also the founder and president of the Indianapolis Bar Association, and he was also the president of Purdue University's Board of Trustees. The formal launch of the Addison Harris Lecture Series began in 1958 with a dedication address by U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was on hand to dedicate this building, which now has become Bear Hall. Past Harris Lectures, which we traditionally publish in issues of the Indiana Law Journal, have included some of the most prominent and distinguished scholars and leading minds of our generations. They are people who have influenced and changed the way we think, and have had a tremendous impact on the law and on legal institutions. Over the decades, they've included a renowned group of speakers, including, among others, Judith Resnick, Martha Minow, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Amy Klobuchar, Cass Sunstein, and civil rights icon Julian Bond. Today, we're excited to welcome you, Professor Anupam Chander. I do want to mention that Professor Chander's presentation today affords us an opportunity to recognize and to celebrate the launching of the Maurer School of Law's new Law and Technology program. The Maurer School of Law has been a longtime leader in the development and innovative programming and research in the areas of intellectual property, cybersecurity, information privacy, bioethics, and the study of complex relationships between technology, law, and society. Our recently launched Law and Technology program brings together a wide range of expertise from throughout Maurer School of Law's faculty to create an integrated platform for research, academic collaborations, and student experiences to ensure continued and concentrated growth for our school in these important areas that will continue to grow both in prevalence and in importance. So again, welcome to all of you. Those of you who've braved the snow and those of you who have not. And without more, I will turn the podium over to Professor Jay Krishnan. He is the Milt and Judy Stewart Professor and also the director of the Milt and Judy Stewart Center on the Global Legal Profession. Jay.
So let me just say first how happy I am to welcome Professor Chander here to deliver the Harris Lecture today. Anupam, I'm so sorry about the weather. There's only so much, alas, that I could have done about that. As the Dean has mentioned, even though the weather has made it difficult for people to be here in person, as she said, there are many people in the Zoom audience, and so we're very, very excited to have you with us. So just as some background, Professor Chander is the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Law and Technology at Georgetown Law School. He's an international expert on the global regulation of new technologies. A graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School, Professor Chander clerked for the Honorable Chief Judge John O. Newman of the Second Circuit and the Honorable Judge William A. Norris of the Ninth Circuit. Then he practiced law in New York and Hong Kong with Cleary Gottlieb. Professor Chander has been a visiting law professor at Yale, the University of Chicago, Stanford, Cornell, and Tsinghua University in China. He previously served as the director of the California International Law Center, and he was the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis. Professor Chander is a member of the American Law Institute, and he has also served on the Executive Council of the American Society of International Law, where he co-founded the International Law and Technology Interest Group. Professor Chander is a prolific scholar in several different areas of the law. He works on the cutting edge of communications and technology law, international trade, intellectual property, and privacy law. But what I have to say that what I really respect about his work is that in his writings, he always makes it a point to talk about how these different areas of the law affect the human condition. He cares about what law means in everyday life to everyday people. And given the global environment in which we live today, the application of his work to such broad audiences make him an incredibly valuable voice in both our scholarly and public policy discourses. And I just need to add one last point, which is that in addition to the amazing substantive contributions of his work, Professor Chander is brilliant when it comes to the titles of his articles and books. I invite you to visit his webpage, where you will see that he literally has some of the best titles in all of legal scholarship. So with that said, Anupam, thank you for coming today. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thanks very much, Joe. Thanks very much, Jay, and thanks very much to Dean Ochoa, whom I've long admired. And also thanks to all my friends on the faculty here, which I have many, and it's great to see you here in Bloomington. This visit is also an opportunity for me to return to my Midwestern roots. I actually grew up 2 hours from here in the town of Oxford, Ohio. So I have to sheepishly tell you that I am, in fact, a Buckeye. But I hope you'll excuse me, because I have another connection to IU Bloomington, which is that my mother has a master's degree in information and library science from this very institution. So I am very proud to return to her alma mater to give the Addison Harris Lecture. Okay. So today I want to talk about fissures between two important values, the values of privacy and trade. These seem to be in conflict, and I want to suggest that the two are far more intertwined historically than you might expect. This talk builds on work with Paul Schwartz. So I have a new paper with Paul just published last week in the University of Chicago Law Review. But it's an extension of that work. It goes far beyond what that paper says in its current form. So last week, Maine became the 28th state to ban TikTok on state devices. Citing unspecified risks to the sensitive and confidential data that we are entrusted to protect. In so doing, it joined the Hoosier state, which had earlier banned TikTok on December 30th. Last week, too, the University of Texas banned TikTok on its Wi-Fi networks. And TikTok, the technology advisor explained, offers this trove of potentially sensitive information to the Chinese government. Of course, some students simply switched to their cellular data plans, gobbling up data, and apparently risking their own privacy and the security of the great state of Texas in the process. So our privacy and trade then in inevitable conflict. Is your data unsafe because it leaves your country? Does trade undermine privacy? That is the premise then of many contemporary internet conflicts. So the flurry of state bans of TikTok began with South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who ordered a ban on TikTok on all state devices on November 29th. South Dakota's PBS and public radio stations deleted their TikTok accounts. The tourism department of the state also deleted its 62,000 follower account on TikTok. I'm not sure exactly what the privacy and security risk of South Dakota's tourism department's TikToks actually is. After all, I'm pretty sure that the presidents on Mount Rushmore are not actually real. But the US is hardly alone in declaring a foreign-owned enterprise information service to be a threat to privacy or security. Even before Governor Kristi Noem declared a foreign app illegal, French authorities last November also declared it illegal to use Microsoft Office 365 in the educational institutions of the state and in other government services. The official guidance targets the free versions of the services, but the rationale extends to all versions. In announcing the ban, the French Minister of National Education cited a ruling by the French Data Protection Authority, the CNIL, that recommended that French authorities choose companies that, quote, do not transfer data to the United States. France was following the lead of Germany. So France was following the lead of Germany, which had in 2019 banned schools from using an even broader array of cloud services from Google, Microsoft, and Apple. Now, I'm not actually sure that anyone uses Apple's iWork for actual work, so perhaps this was a smart idea to train students on to avoid getting kids hooked on the Apple cloud. So when Denmark implemented a ban on Google services in education last year, it created chaos because half of Danish schools used Chromebooks, and there it had to pause the ban till later this year. The European bans flow from as a consequence of a ruling by the Court of Justice of the European Union in 2020. In a case brought by Max Schrems, and so I'm going to point to Maddie here because Maddie worked for NOIB, the NGO that Max founded. In a case brought by Max Schrems, the European Court held that the principal mechanism used by Facebook to transfer data to the United States was illegal under European law. So in a recent paper, I described this set of bans as a kind of dangerous waters theory of the internet. It's unsafe to send your data across the Pacific or across the Atlantic. In other words, it's unsafe for us to send our data abroad and unsafe for others to send their data to us. So if Texas students can't dance on TikTok, French students can't power up their Chromebooks. So as these examples show, the dangerous waters theory of the internet undermines the internet's global nature. It rips apart the World Wide Web. So I will argue that this framing of trade as a threat to privacy is woefully incomplete. That in fact, history and the present show that the critical role of trade in establishing privacy. Concerns for commerce, I will argue, drove privacy law over the last few decades. So let's step back to the 1970s. In the late 1970s, a fire alarm in a factory in Malmö, Sweden would trigger an alarm at the local fire brigade, as you'd expect. But it would also trigger a message sent by satellite link to General Electric's computers in Cleveland, Ohio, which would then in turn inform the Malmö Fire Brigade what it should expect to find in the warehouse when it arrived, so that they could take the appropriate resources and deploy the appropriate tactics. After some concerns were raised about both the network failure potential and the political risk of this approach, the computer server was moved closer to home. In 1989, I'm going to take three little episodes here. The second one. In 1989, Fiat France sought to consolidate employee information at its headquarters in Turin, Italy. The CNIL, which I mentioned earlier, the French Data Protection Authority, protested because Italy at the time lacked a national data privacy law. Fiat, in order to placate the CNIL, contractually agreed to provide privacy protections even in Italy. And in 1994, Citibank was launching a credit card with German railway company Deutsche Bahn. A German data protection authority was troubled by the fact that the information was to be processed in the United States. Citibank made headlines when it entered into an agreement permitting Germany's data police to come to the US to inspect its data processing operations. As these examples show, conflicts between privacy and trade were well known for the many decades past. The risk that privacy rules created for trade was so well known in the 1980s that there was an acronym and a name coined for this: Trans-Border Data Flows, TBDF or TDF for short. Concerns about how privacy impacted trans-border data flows were very much on the international policy agenda throughout the 1980s and beyond. So such concerns were key motivations to all of the international privacy instruments entered into in the 1980s and the 1990s. So here are the principal instruments. Let's begin by examining the first. In 1980, the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, adopted the guidelines governing the protection of privacy and transborder flows of personal data. The OECD expert group that wrote the guidelines was chaired by Australian Michael Kirby, who served as a justice on the High Court of Australia. Also that year, in 1980, Justice Kirby wrote an article in the Stanford Journal of International Law, explaining his views on international privacy. And in this article, he captured the contours of the arguments that would follow in the next few decades. This article sounds like it could have been written today if you go back and read it. He began by observing that some countries were, in fact, adopting data privacy laws. However, he observed protective legislation in one country could be readily circumvented by storing data in another country that lacked such protections. So at the same time, he noted about the possibility of data protectionism. Sorry, here, let's make sure. That is, the legislation nominally for the purpose of data protection could actually have such objectives as the protection of domestic industries. Now, in order to avoid unnecessary restrictions on transborder data flows, it will be imperative, he said, to agree upon international standards for privacy legislation, thus the OECD guidelines. Justice Kirby concluded by arguing for achieving a proper balance between flows of privacy and the legitimate protection of individual privacy. So the OECD guidelines offered a solution built on two cornerstones. First, a commitment to a set of fundamental data privacy protections, and second, an agreement to permit flows of data to other countries unless they didn't protect data privacy in accordance with those fundamental privacy rules. So these are the two cornerstones that have been the foundation of international privacy law ever since. Thus, the international agreement to protect privacy simultaneously served multiple purposes, as Justice Kirby recognized. First, it avoided regulatory evasion by moving data overseas to less regulated jurisdictions, that first concern that I mentioned earlier. It did so by ratcheting up the privacy standards in those other jurisdictions. Second, it sought to reduce the need to establish barriers to such flows in order to ensure data protection, because the data would now be safe if it traveled abroad. And third, it offered a mechanism to prevent the blocking of data flows for reasons of protectionism. So reflecting on the OECD guidelines 30 years later, Justice Kirby noted, one does not normally think of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as a major player in the global elaboration of human rights. But indeed, as he argued in this case, it was. As I've said, the same formula would be used again and again. Indeed, it would form the basis architecture of international privacy law. As we see in the 1981 in the Council of Europe's Convention 108. So I won't go through the convention here, but it follows very much the same framework. But now let's move to the document that you may be more familiar with, the Data Protection Directive, which is what Max Schrems is, and its successor, the General Data Protection Regulation, is the basis for the litigation that he has conducted over the last decade. The European Data Protection Directive, is also committed to this same architecture. The trade facilitative goal of the Data Protection Directive is not just in Article 1, which states member states shall not prohibit the free flow of personal data across the Union. It's in its very title, the free movement of such data. Trade is very much built into the foundations. It is part of the raison d'etre of these instruments. And indeed, bringing privacy law to all corners of the European Union was a critical part of creating a single market in Europe. So far from a story of a unified Europe with a strong legal commitment to privacy as a fundamental right arising out of a shared history, we see instead European states adopting privacy laws at different speeds. So here's a timeline I did of when each of these countries, each of these EU member states as they then were, when they adopted comprehensive national data privacy laws. And many of these countries spurred by a desire to integrate their economies with the larger economies of the European Union and to benefit from the increased trade that offered. Many of the countries from Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Finland only established national comprehensive data protection law after the EU began negotiating the Data Protection Directive. And as the EU pushed eastward after 1995, bringing in new member states, the Eastern European states too adopted comprehensive privacy laws in order to be able to trade freely with the markets of Western Europe. Thus, data protection law expanded along with the EU itself. Okay, so let me now back up for 1 second to talk about a kind of broader question of the relationship between privacy and trade. Here I've tried to show a kind of historical relationship, but I'm going to talk about some other aspects of that relationship. So some argue that privacy cannot be considered within trade law because that would subject a human right to an economic regime. Privacy is a superior value to trade and that therefore should not be considered within a trade framework at all, this argument goes. And so this is the great European privacy scholar, Spiros Simitis. He has a wonderful line, "This is not bananas that we are talking about." So, and indeed, the flow of personal data across borders is different than the flow of bananas across oceans. As Svetlana Yakovla and Christina Irian observe, personal data is peculiar in the way it combines the dignity of a human being with economic properties valuable for commercial activity. Bananas, after all, I might add, do not carry our likes, dislikes, health status, and where we were last Saturday night. But the comparison still requires more unpacking. First, the linking of the two regimes does not imply the superiority of trade over privacy. Linking privacy and trade does not necessarily downgrade privacy as a value inferior to trade. Rather, it says that trade can be restricted when it serves privacy to do so, but not when privacy is a fig leaf for protectionism or other such discrimination. Privacy can remain the superior value, but only when it is in fact the real motivation. Indeed, as Simitis made his remark, the WTO was considering claims by Latin American nations about bananas brought against the European Union. And the international law scholars will remember this, this dispute. The claims were brought by Latin American countries that said that Europe was discriminating in its bananas regime in favor of its own colonial, its former colonies, and charging them high tariffs as a way to favor its former colonies. This dispute would roil the WTO for more than a decade and finally be settled within with the European Union's reform of its banana import system. Second, the example of bananas shows the way that international trade law engages with an important human value, namely health. Food safety and health are part of phytosanitary rules supported by the WTO. The WTO helps assure that bananas can be grown anywhere and consumed safely everywhere. And these rules rely upon international food safety standards. Third, the comparison of bananas and privacy also illuminates a critical issue in global distributive justice. Bananas are exactly the kind of unprocessed export that developing countries have long complained that they are the source of. Exporting literally tons of bananas has hardly made countries rich. And international economic order, where developing countries export low-value unprocessed goods, while rich countries export high-value finished goods and services, allows the rich world to garner most of the benefits of trade. And in more than a quarter century of application, the European Union has thus far only found 2 developing countries, Argentina and Uruguay, to have adequate data protection, allowing them to supply generally higher valued information-based services to the European Union without cumbersome and expensive processes. So here, this is part of a larger argument that you can see in our Paul's and my paper, that this raises these kinds of questions, raise issues of distributive justice, because it affects who can access those markets. I've offered the possibility that Americans can't access the European markets, but that is going to be settled. Everyone pretty much knows it, and Biden and the European Commission have and the EU have reached some agreement that hopefully will be put into place that will allow data to flow freely between Europe and the United States. So there are yet additional reasons to link privacy and trade that go beyond bananas. Fourth, linking privacy and trade is precisely what the European Union did, as I have tried to show. Both the Data Protection Directive and the GDPR state that data protection cannot be used as a basis for interfering with trade. The EU recognized that such a link was essential to its goal of a single market. The link of privacy to trade is possible, of course, because the GDPR and its predecessor, the Data Protection Directive, establishes EU-wide privacy law, such that privacy protections travel with the data. So desire for trade with the European Union has also led many other states to establish or strengthen their data privacy law, often modeling it on the Data Protection Directive, or more recently, the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. Indeed, data protection is one of the most prominent examples of the Brussels effect in action. So again, we see there the desire for privacy prompting the enhancement of the desire for trade promoting then the protections for privacy. Japan, for example, recently strengthened its privacy law in order to meet the European Union's requirements to achieve adequacy. Fifth, privacy can support trade. The more we trust that trade will benefit us, the more likely we are to engage in it. Data privacy thus helps ensure that personal data can be shared across borders. This is a central goal of European Union law, which seeks to ensure that data can be sent safely, both within the European Union and beyond. And finally, data privacy can be enhanced by trade. Just as keeping money in the bank is generally safer than keeping money under the mattress, storing data in world-class systems is often safer than keeping that data on local computers. Of course, whether including privacy in trade law enhances privacy depends on the details of that linkage. So the details matter very much. But I want to make the broad argument here that linking the two should not make us should not be something that we see as illegitimate. And to conclude, I'm going to return quickly, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, to the TikTok ban and the various European bans from Google to Apple to Microsoft. So let me make two broad points. I discussed earlier the architecture of the OECD's approach to international data protection. The US formula towards privacy and trade has adopted only one of the two cornerstones, a commitment to the free flow of data, but not a binding commitment to significant and robust set of privacy protections. The US formula thus is not enough. You can't commit to trade without knowing that the data is protected. Now, the EU formula towards privacy and trade includes strong privacy protections. That is certainly clear, but sometimes feels like it has a weak commitment to free flow of data because it's very hard to convince the European Union that their data is ever going to be safe. So overall, I want to conclude by suggesting that there are trade and privacy have reinforced each other over the last 50 years and can continue to do so. Thank you.
I was asked to make a very, very basic announcement, far less useful than the great presentation Anupam just gave. But that is that for guests viewing today's lecture via the webinar that would like to receive Indiana CLE credit, the attendance code is 93323. And please look for instructions on submitting this code to the CLE Commission in the webinar chat. And in-person attendees, if there are any wanting CLE credit, should sign on the sheet outside the room. With that, we invite anyone here or on Zoom to ask any questions you might have following this presentation.
I'm going to be calling on Maddie to go first. I really put him on the spot. He was asking me a question earlier, and I said, just we don't have time.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to ask, considering this linkage and the motivations behind the GDPR, how should that influence the US's national security policy towards data? Because it is getting in the way of companies like Google and Facebook that we want to support.
So what Maddie's referring to specifically is the fact that our national security system relies a lot upon surveillance, as does national security across the world. Lots of concerns have been raised about, since the Snowden revelations, about the extent of national surveillance in the United States and the ability of the United States intelligence services to collect huge amounts of information, especially about foreigners when they are abroad. And so Maddie is asking, well, that's actually has an adverse economic impact. I'm trying to, if I'm hearing you correctly, has an adverse economic impact on American companies because now they are seen as tools of the CIA or the NSA. And therefore, they breed fear just like TikTok breeds fear in the United States, right? So, and so this is a kind of a broad problem. I think it's actually a problem that will exist for a global internet. It is a kind of, comes with the territory of data and globalization. Oh boy, Zhao is going to come up and I had dinner with Zhao. He's going to ask me, why do we even want a global internet? So I've got to be ready for that. I'm already dreading the hard question here. I think that this is the United States, of course, negotiated very so the first day that Joe Biden took office on January 21st, 2020, 2 years ago, just almost to the day. On that very first day, he appointed an ambassador to negotiate with the European Union on this data privacy national security interface. Okay, it was that important. The very first day he took office, he appointed Chris Hoff. And so this has been a hugely critical issue. And I think the Biden administration has done a lot of work in trying to create more protections for foreigners caught up in our intelligence system. I'll leave it to others, including Asaf here, to opine on the robustness of all that. But I think it's a very serious effort, and so I think that But I should point out that we're one of the few countries that actually has any protections in place. This is not national security services often operate outside a legal apparatus. And so this is, there is something creditworthy in the fact that we legalize so much, at least in the sense that we put it in a legal framework. I'll let others assess whether or not that's sufficient. I know Max is certainly not, doesn't believe it's sufficient. But yeah, I think I think it's a huge question and a very important one. And I think and the Biden administration's approach was actually one that said, this is not just protecting data of Europeans. Other countries could be subject to such protections, nationals of other countries in certain cases. So it's actually a far more a broader approach than what the Obama administration did with the EU-US Privacy Shield. So Max did important work in prompting this change by the administration. So I think that actually has been super useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a number of questions, but first I'll ask the one that you mentioned. Why do we want a global internet? And in your presentation, you did mention sort of the neoliberal idea of free trade and development, which we know has issues, right? And so why are we now just applying that to the internet and thinking that it's going to work? A second question is you're linking trade law with privacy. But the previous question actually made me think of the fact that national security is, that term, those exceptions in international trade law are causing, a lot of issues recently. So what do we do there? And then lastly, you are not very interested in bans, as you started the presentation with, but your presentation, if anything, showed that bans work until, something happens. And so the only reason countries did anything is because they were banned. And so for a country that is just not going to adopt a GDPR in good faith, like a China or something, how does that work?
Okay. Great. All great questions. Okay. So free trade and development, why just return to the model of free trade and hope that it prompts development? Zhao's first question. Well, let's imagine the alternative, right? Which is to shut off foreign countries from the global south from providing services to the global north, right? That is not a unreasonable prospect of the system that we currently are moving towards. The European Union approach basically treats every data that leaves the European Union subject to a very tight exfiltration scheme, one that can be so expensive or nearly impossible to navigate for many countries across the world. The US is able to negotiate exceptions to that regime in some sense because of its unique power and importance, but that's not true of the global south. So just imagine a world, and I think this is a real one, where the rest of the world outside Europe and the United States, and maybe Japan and Korea, are not able to provide services, information services, which is what you and I all do, what much of the world is moving towards, to any place outside, right? That I think should cause us to recognize that that is a world that breeds more injustice and inequality. Okay. The national security exceptions that are arising in trade law and this kind of complications, the US unfortunately keeps on messing up my arguments. So the US is saying, we can't buy steel from Canada because that's a national security risk and silly things like that, right? So the US is asserting national security in laughable ways that make the whole trade apparatus very fragile. It's exposing the fragility of our trade regime when the biggest proponent and builder of that regime treats it like a plaything. And so the US actions through Democratic and Republican administrations, unfortunately, haven't been, I think, helpful on this front. And the reason that other countries didn't resort to such laughable claims was because they knew that any country could make those claims at any time. You can always make some national security argument for whatever policy you want to domesticate. And so that had traditionally been an argument that the Americans did not want to make, knowing that that would cause the collapse of the whole trade order. Now that we've given up on the whole trade order, we don't care so much. So it's you may not be aware that we've given up on the trade order, but that's really what multiple administrations have done over the last decade. Shockingly to many scholars of the subject. So we built the system and we decided it wasn't working well enough for us, so we decided to blow it up. Hard to imagine. I still don't get it. So it's baffles me to today. All right. Ban's work, Zhao asks, and I actually said, Max Schrems, did some good with getting the U.S. to saying you can't send data to the United States, caused some good. I think that's all well and good. Now, remember, the data continued to flow. In all these cases, people just ignored the rulings because there was no way that the data was ever going to stop. Okay, so the bans didn't have any real they caused a lot of consternation, lots of costs, et cetera, hiring a lot of lawyers, but the data continued to flow. Because there was no other way, and the Europeans weren't really going to stop data flows to the United States. That was just not in the cards. It would cripple their own companies, not just our companies, their companies depend upon American companies, just like we depend upon European companies. Okay, they have operations here. They need to send data here about what's going on in Europe, et cetera. They have research arms here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the United States, the bans. Look, I think these kinds of controversies can galvanize action, and maybe that's the way that things change. So that may be the case. But there's also the possibility that we just move to a kind of steady state where those bans persist, despite the fact that they ruin much of what was possible. And I think that, like I said, the U.S. and EU would always make up. We've made up every time when there's a Schrems 3, which there will be. I think this time the CJEU is not gonna strike it down. So anyway, but anyway, it'll be interesting to see what happens in that context.
Thanks, Anupam. I actually wanted to track back to the Kirby excerpt that you started your talk with to pick up on a couple of things. So one of them was his mention that his concern that privacy barriers could essentially grab back what was given up through the trade regime, right? So as the trade regime expanded and tariffs and other trade barriers fell, states could resort to this kind of extraterritorial application of local laws that would pull back those benefits or advantages. And I'm wondering, there's some work by Greg Schaefer, I think one piece with Godinez, where they talked about this as a general matter, right? So extraterritorially applicable standards, and they actually use phytosanitary as one of their examples, as you did in the talk. Can essentially be used as recapturing advantages that are lost through the trade regime. So one question I had is if you see privacy as a special case, the linkage between privacy and trade as a special case, or as a general instantiation of that general dynamic. And then, so Kirby's solution then was multilateral standards. And as we move toward, I'm maybe a little less optimistic about the Schrems 3, or, we're going to have like Schrems 9 at some point, but
he's a young guy. He's been doing this for a while.
So one of the real barriers, I think, to full multilateral agreement on privacy regulations now is that in the EU, it has been so constitutionalized, right? So it is now clearly a part of their basic law. It's from a human rights perspective, and therefore they are adopting such a stringent approach to protection that is embedded in laws that cannot be undone through treaty agreement. So I'm wondering are we going to get past that?
Oh, great questions, Hannah. Okay, so just first, just the kind of broader observation about the rise of these kinds of new non-tariff barriers to trade, right? So what you see is the move from traditional barriers to trade, which was like tariffs or bans, so you can't bring those goods in, to other softer ways to discriminate against foreign providers, which non-tariff barriers to trade, right? And so privacy could become such a non-tariff barrier to trade, and that's been the concern at the heart of those transborder data flow discussions since the end of the 70s into today. Literally in 1980s, lots of hearing, in 1980 even, lots of hearings in the U.S. House, about transborder data flows. This is very much on the agenda for decades. Now, I haven't read Stavros's and Greg Schaefer's paper, which I need to, obviously, I'm sorry. So is this a kind of, is privacy a special case? I think I'm not convinced that it's a special case. I think that there's a lot that feels to me like the kinds of, so it is, so there's a lot of human rights implications of trade, period. From environment to labor, now, expansion into kind of issues of gender and indigenous rights, lots of human rights that are playing out in this kind of economic space. And so I think, I don't think of it as particularly distinct. And the reason I mentioned the phytosanitary is because I think there are a lot of things that we depend on, including on foreign providers, including food, which, literally can kill us, right? And so, that shows you that we trust in the system to some extent. And what I like to say about food is that, if you look at the, poisonings in the United States, they can often be of domestic food, the domestic food chain. And I always think if that had been a producer in some foreign country rather than in California, it would be like, it would have be treated very differently. The baby food shortage was of plants just a little north of here, right? And so imagine if that baby food had been made in China, suddenly all goods from China would have been declared, designed to kill us, right, or something along those lines. And so I think so I try to my general impulse is to treat it as similar. Obviously, every area will have its own distinctions, but not as extremely peculiar in that way. Now, the question about hope for multilateral standards and the kind of hardness of EU law, et cetera, is that possible? So I just did a paper for an EU think tank based out of Germany, and looking at the you mentioned. Actually, Zhao mentioned whether China has a GDPR. China's PIPL. So I looked at the PIPL, the GDPR, and also California's privacy law. And what you get is something that seems very similar to what Kirby says in 1980, which is he says, look, if you look at the privacy laws that are emerging across the world, then they actually share a lot in common. And so I think there's a lot to build on. And I think that there's, I'm not convinced that we're that far apart on privacy. Like I said, my story is an effort to kind of retell the European narrative, which has become so deeply entrenched as a fundamental part of their fiber, when there's so much of it that is really, part of a kind of desire to create a European Union. And this is always just the invention of a tradition, right? That is part of this story. That is, so I still tend to be hopeful, and that is, so Paul and I, in our paper, we call for a global privacy agreement. And that follows that kind of OECD cornerstone model, which is, hey, everyone agrees to these sets of rules, and therefore your data is safe. And with rare exception, that means that you can't stop data from flowing to those countries.
So we have time for one final question.
Hi, Professor. My name is Simon Sun. I'm an SJD candidate here. I have one broad question about privacy itself. And building on the previous questions about national security, so one of the implication, I think recently, when it comes to data, privacy, and national security is the Snowden revelation. And the result is a new policy called data localization. And my question is that how does this new policy of data localization fit into your analysis, especially it's been advocated from China, and I see India having this kind of regulation on or policy on such a thing. And then on your idea about or proposal about the global agreement of privacy, in your research, have you found any differences with the understanding of privacy? As you said, privacy is an inherently European or Western approach. How does that interact with the Eastern, the global South culture, where privacy might not be something built into the culture itself? And how would you overcome that? Thank you.
Great question. So what's the first thing you do when you check into a hotel in Europe? What do they ask you for? Passport. They didn't ask me that for that when I checked in last night, right? Do you know that in Europe, you're in Scandinavia, remember Trump's tax returns? Well, if he had been Scandinavian, all those would be public because every Scandinavian's tax returns are public. Okay. I just want to say that things are a little bit more complicated. There's like, so this is not as simple a story. And so data privacy when I was in law school, there wasn't a subject like privacy law. There weren't special courses in privacy law. This is a new subject even to American law school. So I think that this is all being, so I would say that there's all these things are more open and we should remember the real histories before we as we think about how to approach them. Thanks.
Thank you.
Join me in thanking Professor Anupam Chander,